A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at the numbers from the June 2025 conflict this morning, and there is one specific figure that just refuses to sit still in my brain. It is the 14%. We spent so much time celebrating the 86% interception rate, which, to be fair, is a miracle of modern engineering and a testament to the layered defense of the Arrow and David sling systems. But the 14% that got through represents a massive amount of high explosives hitting populated areas. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the Iranian ballistic missile warhead specifically, and it is a timely check-in, because we are seeing a fundamental shift in how the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is thinking about payload versus precision. We are moving away from the era of surgical strikes and into a period of maximum payload warfare that changes the entire calculus of civil defense.
It is the most critical part of the equation that often gets overshadowed by the spectacle of the interceptors and the trails of light in the night sky. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been digging into the technical specifications of these newer warheads, especially following the March 2026 combat debut of the Sajil. When we talk about a ballistic missile, most people picture the whole rocket, this giant multi-stage cylinder. But that is just the delivery vehicle. The warhead is the only part that actually matters to the person on the ground. And what we are seeing now, specifically with the recent escalation, is a move toward what I call the heavy hitter doctrine. The Khorramshahr-4, which the Iranians call the Khyber-Shekan, is carrying a warhead that weighs between 1,500 and 1,800 kilograms. To put that in perspective, that is like dropping a full-sized SUV filled with high explosives from space at several times the speed of sound.
And that is where the physics gets terrifying. Because it is not just the explosives, right? You have this massive object re-entering the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. When that 1.8-ton mass hits the ground, the kinetic energy alone is enough to create a massive crater, but then you have the chemical energy of the explosive charge detonating simultaneously. Daniel mentioned that these are often military-grade high explosives, like TNT variants or RDX compositions. If a 1-ton warhead hits an urban block, are we talking about the destruction of a single building, or is the overpressure wave much wider than that? Why are we suddenly talking about warhead weight instead of just range or accuracy?
We are talking about weight because the IRGC has realized that if you make the explosion big enough, you do not need to be as accurate. The Aerospace Force Commander recently signaled a deliberate doctrine shift, publicly stating that Iran will now only focus on launching missiles with warheads over 1 ton. They are moving away from the era of trying to hit a specific 5-meter target with a small, precise charge. They are basically saying, if we can get within 50 or 100 meters of the target with a 1-ton bomb, the precision does not matter anymore because the target will be gone anyway. This is a response to the high interception rates. If only 14% of your missiles are getting through, you want those 14% to do the absolute maximum amount of damage possible.
It is a return to a more primitive but arguably more effective form of terror. If you cannot guarantee a bullseye, just make the arrow bigger. But that leads us into the other side of this, which is the saturation tactic. We have been hearing a lot about cluster munitions lately. In fact, just a few days ago, on March 12th, CNN reported that these cluster warheads are actively challenging the Israeli air defenses. About half of the ballistic missiles fired in this current wave have been equipped with these submunition dispensers. We covered the concept of the shimmering curtain back in episode 973, but the technical reality of how these things function at 7 kilometers up is worth revisiting, because it is a nightmare for a radar operator.
There is a very common misconception that these are MIRVs, or Multiple Independently Targetable Reentry Vehicles. They are not. A true MIRV is a masterpiece of engineering where each individual warhead has its own guidance system, its own heat shield, and can hit a different city hundreds of miles apart. Iran does not have that yet. What they have are submunition dispensers, which are much simpler and, in some ways, more annoying for a missile defense system. The missile reaches its apex, starts its descent, and at roughly 7 kilometers of altitude, the warhead casing splits open. It releases hundreds of small bomblets, each weighing maybe 2 or 3 kilograms.
So instead of the Arrow 3 or David Sling looking for one big hot target, the radar suddenly sees 80 or 100 separate objects falling through the sky. I assume the physics of that dispersal is not about hitting a specific building, but about creating a footprint of destruction. How does that actually force a change in the defense strategy?
The footprint is roughly 8 kilometers wide depending on the release altitude and the spin of the dispenser. These bomblets are unguided, they just fall. But from a strategic standpoint, it is an interceptor exhaustion tactic. If you are the commander of an air defense battery and you see a missile that you know is carrying 100 submunitions, you have a split-second decision to make. Do you try to hit the main warhead before it opens? Because once it opens, you cannot stop 100 separate bomblets. You simply do not have enough interceptors in the world to shoot down every individual submunition. This is why we are seeing the push for the Arrow 4 deployment later this year. The system is being specifically tuned to handle these saturation attacks and improve that 86% success rate.
It is a math problem where the defender is always at a disadvantage. An Arrow 3 interceptor costs millions of dollars. A cluster warhead full of unguided bomblets is relatively cheap to manufacture. If Iran can force Israel to burn through its entire inventory of high-end interceptors just to stop a handful of these saturation strikes, they create a window of vulnerability for the heavy hitters, the 1.8-ton Khorramshahr missiles, to get through. It is a classic shell game played at Mach 10.
And the kinetic energy we mentioned earlier is a huge factor here. Even if the explosive fails to detonate, a 1,000 kilogram mass hitting a building at 3,000 meters per second is going to bring that building down. When you add the high explosives, you get an overpressure wave. For a 1-ton warhead, the lethal blast radius for unreinforced structures can extend over 100 meters, but the secondary effects are even worse. The shock wave shatters glass and turns every window in a 3-block radius into 1,000 tiny projectiles. This is why the 14% leakage is so catastrophic. If 70 missiles get through out of 500, and they are carrying these massive payloads, you are looking at 70 tons of high explosives hitting a country the size of New Jersey.
I want to pivot to the more controversial part of Daniel's prompt, which is the unconventional threat. There were those intelligence reports back in December 2025 from Iran International about the IRGC developing chemical and biological payloads for their solid fuel missiles. Then in February 2026, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies published an analysis on Iran's covert chemical weapons program. From a physics perspective, Erman, how hard is it to actually deliver a chemical agent via a ballistic missile? Because my intuition says that hitting the ground at Mach 10 would just incinerate whatever chemicals are inside.
Your intuition is spot on, Korn. This is one of those areas where the Hollywood version of the threat and the actual physics are at odds. A standard ballistic missile warhead is designed to explode on impact or at a very low altitude. If you fill a standard high-explosive warhead with a liquid chemical agent like sarin or VX, and that missile slams into the concrete at 3,000 meters per second, the kinetic energy is converted into heat so intense that it would likely flash burn or decompose the chemical agent before it could ever disperse. You would end up with a very small, very hot chemical fire at the impact site rather than a lethal cloud drifting over a city. It is actually a very inefficient way to use a chemical weapon.
So, if someone actually wanted to use a chemical warhead effectively, they would need a completely different design. It would have to be an aerosol dispersal system, right? Something that triggers an airburst at a specific altitude to gently mist the agent over a wide area.
And that is a much higher engineering hurdle. You need a burster charge that is powerful enough to break the container and aerosolize the liquid, but not so powerful that it destroys the molecular structure of the agent. You also need to account for the massive heat of reentry. These warheads are glowing red hot as they come back into the atmosphere. You have to insulate the chemical payload so it does not cook off before it even reaches the dispersal altitude. The reports from February mentioned that Iran is pursuing these specialized dispersal warheads, but it is not as simple as just pouring chemicals into a Shahab 3. You need sophisticated cooling systems or a pop-top design where the nose cone is jettisoned to allow the payload to remain stable.
It feels like the biological threat has even more hurdles. Most pathogens are incredibly sensitive to heat. If you put anthrax spores or a viral agent in a warhead that is hitting 5,000 degrees Celsius on its outer skin during reentry, you are basically just building a very expensive, very fast incinerator. Unless they have developed sophisticated cooling and slow dispersal mechanisms, the nuclear truck scenario we discussed in episode 698 is still a much more likely worst case than a biological one.
I agree, though we should not be totally dismissive. The IRGC has shown a lot of ingenuity in adapting civilian tech for military use. If they use a design where the payload is released at a high altitude and allowed to flutter down in protected canisters, they might find a way. But even then, weather is a huge factor. A chemical attack depends entirely on wind speed, humidity, and temperature inversions. If the wind is blowing the wrong way, you just gassed your own front line or sent the cloud out into the Mediterranean. Compared to the reliable, predictable destruction of a 1.8-ton high-explosive warhead, the chemical option is actually a lot less attractive from a purely military standpoint. It is more of a psychological weapon than a tactical one in this specific context.
That is an interesting way to look at it. The high-explosive warhead is the honest weapon in their arsenal. You know exactly what it will do. It will knock down buildings and kill people within a specific radius. The shift we are seeing in 2026 toward these massive payloads suggests they have realized that terror and structural damage are more reliable strategic tools than the fickle nature of chemical weapons. But let's talk about the Sedgil for a moment. This is a solid fuel missile that made its combat debut earlier this month. Why does the fuel type matter when we are discussing the warhead's impact?
It matters because of the reaction time and the survivability of the launcher. Liquid-fueled missiles like the older Shahab variants have to be fueled right before launch. That involves a lot of trucks, a lot of activity, and it gives satellite intelligence a huge window to see what is coming. You can see the fueling process from space and hit the missile on the pad. Solid fuel missiles like the Sedgil are basically giant bottle rockets. They can sit in a silo or on a mobile launcher for years, and when the order comes, they can be in the air in minutes. This means the interceptor crews have much less left of launch warning. When the Sedgil was used earlier this month, it represented a jump in sophistication. It is faster, it has a more complex flight path, and it carries a warhead of about 700 kilograms. While that is smaller than the Khorramshahr, the speed and the lack of warning make it much harder to hit.
So the trade-off is speed and surprise versus raw payload. If you are Israel, you are looking at a two-front technical war. On one hand, you have the heavy hitters like the Khorramshahr 4 that can level a city block if they get through. On the other, you have the fast, solid fuel missiles and the cluster munitions that try to overwhelm your sensors. This brings us back to the math of the defense. The Israeli Ministry of Defense estimated that the successful interceptions in the June conflict prevented about $15 billion in property damage. That is a staggering number. But you cannot just look at the dollar value. You have to look at the psychological toll of the leakage.
The psychological toll is exactly what the IRGC is banking on. When a cluster warhead opens up and those bomblets start falling like a shimmering curtain of sparks, the radar might be doing its job, but the people on the ground are seeing a sky full of fire. It creates a sense of helplessness. Even if the bomblets only cause minor damage to a roof or a car, the fact that they fell at all means the shield is not perfect. It is a saturation of the psyche as much as the defense system.
I think we need to look at what the takeaway is for anyone trying to understand this conflict. We often focus on the big boom or the nuclear shadow, but the real, day-to-day threat is this industrial-scale delivery of high explosives. Herman, if you are looking at the next 6 months, what is the specific technical development in warhead design that you are watching for?
I am watching the guidance fins on the warhead sections themselves. We are seeing more maneuverable reentry vehicles, or MARVs. This is where the warhead itself has small fins or thrusters that allow it to shift its trajectory in the final seconds of flight. If you combine a 1-ton warhead with even a rudimentary maneuverability, you make the job of an interceptor like the Arrow 3 exponentially harder. The interceptor has to calculate a moving target that is actively trying to dodge it while falling at several times the speed of sound. If Iran starts mass-producing MAR-RV-equipped warheads for their heavy missiles, the interception rate might actually dip below 80%, and that is where the math gets very dark.
And that is why the Arrow 4 is such a big deal. Boaz Leiby, the CEO of Israel Aerospace Industries, confirmed in February that the deployment is on track for later this year. It is designed specifically to handle those endgame maneuvers and the saturation of submunitions, but it also brings up the cost per kill ratio. We cannot ignore that the defense is far more expensive than the offense here. Every time an Iranian missile is launched, it costs Israel and the United States millions to stop it. It is an economic war of attrition played out in the upper atmosphere.
It really is, and the cluster munitions are the peak of that attrition strategy. They are forcing the defense to treat every single incoming projectile as a high-priority threat because they do not know if it is a single one-ton bomb or a dispenser that is about to turn into 100 smaller bombs. The shimmering curtain is a beautiful name for a horrific tactical reality. The goal is to make the defense so expensive and so complex that it eventually fails through sheer exhaustion of resources.
Well, I think we have established that the Warhead is far more than just a tip on a rocket. It is a sophisticated piece of engineering that dictates the entire strategy of the war, from the massive high-explosive payloads to the exhaustion tactics of submunitions. The IRGC is playing a very specific game of numbers. The shift toward these heavy payloads suggests they are leaning into the 14% that gets through. They want those few hits to be as devastating as possible.
What I find most interesting is that we are seeing the limits of technology on both sides. High-tech interceptors versus low-tech but high-volume payloads. It is a classic struggle. And while the chemical and biological threats are real in a political sense, the physics suggests they are more of a distraction from the very real, very heavy kinetic threat that is already being deployed. The weight of the warhead is the weight of the intent. If you are building a 2-ton warhead, you aren't looking for a surgical strike. You are looking to erase a target from the map.
It is a lot to process. The 14% is the number I'm going to be thinking about for the rest of the day. If you are following this, the key is to look past the launch footage and look at the payload specs. That is where the real story of the war is being written. We have to think about hardening infrastructure and civil defense, because as long as that 14% exists, the danger is absolute.
I agree. We should probably wrap this up before I start calculating the structural integrity of our own building again. It is a habit I picked up while reading these reports.
Good to know we are safe for now. Well, that is a deep dive into the business end of the Iranian missile program. It is a sobering look at the physics of modern conflict, but an essential one if you want to understand why the defense systems are being pushed to their absolute limits right now. The math of survival is getting more complicated every day.
It really is. 2026 is proving to be the year where the theory of missile defense meets the brutal reality of mass payload warfare.
We have covered a lot of ground today, from the 1.8-ton Khorram Shah, 4 payloads to the aerosolization challenges of chemical weapons. If you want to dig deeper into the history of these systems, I really recommend checking out episode 9018 where we did a full breakdown of the transition to solid fuel engineering. It provides a lot of the context for why the Segil is such a game changer this year.
That was a good one. And if you are interested specifically in the cluster munition side, episode 1093 goes into the shimmering curtain doctrine in much more detail than we had time for today. It explains the Soviet origins of some of these dispersal patterns.
Definitely worth a listen. Before we go, we want to say a huge thank you to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes and making sure we don't wander too far into the weeds of orbital mechanics.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the research and generation of this show. We could not do these deep dives into technical specifications without that kind of horsepower.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying these explorations, please consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help us reach new people who are looking for this kind of technical depth and objective analysis.
Or you can find us on Telegram by searching for My Weird Prompts to get notified the second a new episode drops. We are also at myweirdprompts.com if you want to search our full archive of over 1,200 episodes.
We will be back soon with another prompt. stay curious.
And stay informed. Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show. My weird prompts